And in that silence, Britain heard something it hadn't heard in a long time. Defiance. Real, unapologetic defiance from a nation it once ruled. The symbolism wasn't lost on anyone. For generations, British politicians had spoken of partnership and friendship with India. But beneath those phrases lay something older, an assumption of superiority. Modi's decision shattered that illusion in one night. Inside the corridors of Westminster, aides whispered about damage control. Could STARMER salvage his image? Could Britain restore its influence? Or had a single misjudged speech permanently changed the course of history? The press called it a diplomatic earthquake, but to many watching around the world, it was something more, a reckoning. And as cameras rolled outside Downing Street, capturing the chaos, one truth became clear. This wasn't just about visas or politics. It was about pride, power, and perception. For the first time in living memory, it wasn't India seeking validation from London. It was London scrambling for relevance in a world that had moved on. The full weight of the crisis had descended on Britain. Newspapers splashed the story across their front pages in bold, furious headlines. India shuts the door, STARMER's gamble backfires, Britain humiliated abroad. Television screens flickered with images of Modi's calm defiance, beside STARMER's pale frustration. In the corridors of Westminster, exhaustion and fear hung thick in the air. The Labour leader, usually composed and measured, looked like a man trapped between pride and panic. He had underestimated Modi, and now the consequences were spiraling out of control. Inside the Foreign Office, senior officials met behind closed doors, and the intelligence briefings were grim. Reports confirmed this was no impulsive reaction. India's decision was part of a deliberate, strategic response. This was planned, one advisor whispered. They were waiting for a moment like this. STARMER's speech, filled with moral outrage, had given them the perfect opening. And now, London was left scrambling, its diplomatic network silenced overnight. Every attempt to reach New Delhi through back channels was met with cold formality. The message was clear: India wasn't backing down. Meanwhile, inside Modi's cabinet in New Delhi, the mood was triumphant. The Prime Minister's team had anticipated the outrage and prepared for it. "Let them talk," one minister said. "Every word they speak digs the hole deeper." Indian news anchors called it a moment of reckoning, a historic reversal of colonial hierarchy. The phrase "a new independence" echoed across talk shows. For many Indians, this was not just politics, it was dignity. By late afternoon, as tensions escalated, a confidential memo leaked online. An internal Labour document suggesting STARMER's team had planned to pressure India on trade reforms by using moral leverage. The timing was devastating. Indian newspapers splashed the leak under the headline, "Labour's Hidden Agenda." Within hours, the narrative shifted completely. What had started as a debate about democracy now looked like a plot to manipulate India's internal politics. The Indian public erupted. Protesters gathered outside the British High Commission in Delhi, waving flags and chanting, "Respect India's sovereignty." Crowds filled the streets, their anger fueled by every fresh headline. Emboldened by public support, the Indian government went further, announcing the suspension of all ongoing bilateral trade talks worth nearly £30 billion. In London, shock turned to dread. The business sector begged for calm, but STARMER's options were running out. Behind Westminster's tall glass doors, the atmosphere grew suffocating. Advisors whispered about damage control, while media vans camped outside, capturing every flicker of panic. In private, Senior Labour figures questioned whether Starmer could survive the fallout. Some urged him to apologise, others warned it would make him look weak. "We can't bow to Modi," one aide insisted. Another replied quietly, "We already have." By evening, the crisis deepened. Reports emerged that India had begun reviewing the status of British-funded NGOs operating within its borders, accusing them of spreading political propaganda under the guise of aid. Offices were raided, accounts frozen, staff questioned. In London, the Foreign Office called it an overreaction, but to many watching, it looked far more significant, a geopolitical shift decades in the making. For generations, British leaders had spoken of India as a partner, but always with a trace of condescension. Now, Modi had flipped that dynamic entirely. "This isn't India rising," one analyst said. On live television, "This is Britain falling." The words struck like a knife. That night, Starmer sat in his office overlooking the Thames, his reflection mirrored in the dark water below. Advisors came and went, offering statistics, briefings, and excuses, but no solutions. For the first time, he looked uncertain, almost haunted. The Labour leader, who had tried to take the moral high ground, was now isolated, boxed in by a storm he could no longer control. And as the clock struck midnight, one truth echoed across London's silent halls. This wasn't just a diplomatic dispute anymore. It was an identity crisis. Britain was being forced to face something it had avoided for decades. The world had changed, and power had shifted. The empire's shadow had finally faded, leaving a country struggling to find its place in a world that no longer looked up to it. Britain woke to a storm it could no longer contain. The air in Westminster was thick with tension, phones ringing non-stop, ministers arguing behind closed doors, journalists swarming outside like vultures scenting blood. Starmer's leadership, once untouchable, now hung by a thread. What began as a debate over democracy had spiraled into a full-blown political and national reckoning. The latest blow came from New Delhi. Modi's government announced new restrictions on British-funded organizations, accusing them of pushing political propaganda disguised as humanitarian aid. Within hours, offices were raided, accounts frozen, and British staff detained for questioning. In London, disbelief turned to fury. "This is an act of aggression," one MP shouted in Parliament. But the tone of outrage only made things worse. India's foreign ministry responded sharply, "We will not be lectured by those who still see the world through imperial eyes." The words hit Britain like a thunderclap. Across the world, news networks carried the story under one headline: "The day Britain lost its moral voice." American commentators called it the end of the special status London once enjoyed on the global stage. In Brussels, officials whispered about the danger of aligning too closely with a country now seen as diplomatically tone-deaf. And in India, the reaction was euphoric. Crowds celebrated outside Parliament, waving flags and chanting Modi's name. "This is justice," one anchor declared. "For centuries, London dictated to us. Now we decide." Inside Britain, the mood
Let's
was
just
the
bring you
opposite.
these new
Panic
pictures now
turned to
showing the
despair.
egg-throwing
The pound fell again. Universities dependent on Indian students sounded alarms. Airlines reported mass cancellations on routes between London and Delhi. Even the Confederation of British Industry issued a warning. Trade with India could collapse by nearly half within weeks. By mid-morning, the economic ripple had begun. The pound dipped further, shaken by fears of a trade collapse. Business leaders warned of disaster if relations weren't restored. Indian markets remained steady, almost smugly calm, as though signaling that Delhi knew exactly who held the leverage. British exporters called emergency meetings, demanding answers. "What are we supposed to tell our investors?" one CEO asked. No one in government had an answer. Starmer tried to seize back control with a televised statement calling India's move deeply regrettable and undemocratic, but the words fell flat, sounding hollow even to his supporters. Within minutes, Indian media fired back, broadcasting his remarks alongside black-and-white images of British colonial officers, a haunting juxtaposition that sent shockwaves through social media across India. The phrase "no more lectures" became a rallying cry. In London, the backlash was immediate. Conservative MPs seized the moment, accusing Starmer of reckless diplomacy. Rishi Sunak, careful but cutting, warned that the Labour leader had endangered Britain's standing in the world. The Tory benches laughed openly during question time, their jeers echoing through Parliament. "He wanted to look strong abroad," one opposition MP quipped. "Now he looks powerless at home." Even Labour insiders began to whisper doubts behind closed doors. Advisers admitted that Starmer's foreign policy had been naive idealism without foresight. Behind the scenes, Starmer's inner circle fractured. Angela Rayner confronted him directly, telling him he had humiliated the party on the world stage. Senior Labour MPs began whispering what had been unthinkable days earlier, a leadership challenge. As evening fell, the political storm spilled into the streets. Crowds gathered in Parliament Square, waving both Indian and British flags. Some chanted for peace, others demanded Starmer's resignation. The chants echoed off Westminster's stone walls, a haunting reflection of a country divided and unsure of itself. Television anchors described it as the night Britain stared into the mirror of its past. The symbolism was impossible to ignore. History had come full circle, and the empire's ghosts were finally demanding to be reckoned with. Behind palace gates, even the king could not hide his frustration. Sources whispered that Charles had reached out to Modi personally, pleading for calm and warning that the crisis could shatter decades of diplomatic effort. But it was too late. "He feels betrayed by his ministers," one court insider said. "Decades of bridge building undone in days." The monarch, who had spent years strengthening Commonwealth ties, was now watching them crumble before his eyes. And still, Modi remained unmoved. His government released a brief, calculated statement. "All bilateral meetings with the United Kingdom are suspended until mutual respect is restored. No anger, no emotion, just finality." The words echoed through London like a death sentence for an old order. The empire that once commanded half the world now stood isolated, humbled, and uncertain of its place. Starmer appeared on national television one last time, his tone calm, but his eyes hollow. "Britain will never apologize for standing up for democracy," he declared. "We will continue to speak truth, even when others silence it." But the words, once meant to inspire, only deepened the
Before the
divide.
election and since.
Commentators accused him of clinging to pride over reason. One analyst summed it up sharply. "He isn't fighting Modi, he's fighting his own reflection." As the days passed, the economic aftershocks intensified. British companies froze new investments, fearing retaliation. International observers called it the London isolation crisis. On social media, hashtags like #end of soft power and Britain falls behind trended for days. The world wasn't just watching, it was judging. And the verdict was merciless. Britain's age of moral authority was over. Late one night, as protesters clashed outside Parliament, Starmer stood by his window, overlooking the city. The sirens, the shouting, the flashing lights, they all blurred into a single sound. The hum of history turning its page. His aides argued in the background about strategy, tone, damage control, but he barely heard them. Somewhere deep down, he understood what few dared to say aloud, that this was bigger than politics. This was identity. Britain wasn't just losing India's respect, it was losing the illusion that it still ruled the narrative of the modern world. In New Delhi, Modi delivered one final televised address, calm, deliberate. India is not a colony to be scolded, he said. We are an equal on the world stage. His words, steady and measured, were met with thunderous applause. In that moment, something shifted, not just in India, but everywhere. A symbolic torch had been passed. And as the world watched the aftermath unfold, one question echoed across both nations. Had Britain just witnessed the moment it stopped being a world power? Or was this the painful awakening it needed to redefine its place in history? The cameras faded, the crowds dispersed, and the once unthinkable truth lingered in the air. The empire had finally come full circle.